Hey everybody, how you doing today? Let's take a look at the short run aggregate supply curve, also known as the SRAS, and get a further understanding of what this means. And this should be the first video that you watch really after the introduction and overview video to start layering in this understanding of the difference between the short run aggregate supply curve and the long run aggregate supply curve. All right, here we go. So the short run aggregate supply curve looks very much, if you take a look here, it looks very much, right, like the microeconomics aggregate supply curve, in that it is upward sloping, which means there's a positive relationship between the price level and the amount of output that a country's industries will supply. So you see at this price level at P1, right, they're supplying Y1. And then, of course, if the price goes up, all the industries in the country are going to go, hey, if the average price level goes up, they say, hey, let's produce more, let's produce more, let's produce more, okay? And so the short run aggregate supply curve is very similar. Notice it doesn't go through, it would be above the origin of the axis, or the origin of the graph here. And we label it SRAS, okay? So the one thing that's important is that in macroeconomic analysis, the short run is defined as the period of time when the prices of the factor of production do not change. Okay? And mainly this means in that the wage rate is fixed. And one thing that some students miss is that, like, I'm an international teacher, right? I teach in a school in Santiago, Chile, and my wage rate is fixed. It's fixed from now until actually June of 2017, another year and a half. And so no matter what happens to the school, they have to pay me that wage. And then only after the next year and a half can they then change. And that's because they've signed contracts. And most businesses, of course, have contracts with labor unions, and they're good for a couple of years. And so the wage rate is fixed in the short run. And that's a really important thing that you need to realize, and that even if prices fall, if aggregate demand, right, which would come across like this, if aggregate demand were to drop and there would be a general downward pressure on prices, if you're a business, you can't do anything about that, right? And likewise, if the price level, if aggregate demand were to shift outward, what are they going to do? They can't really all of a sudden like grab more people and hire them. No, usually what they do is they start paying overtime for people, right? So the short run then, in the short run, an increase in output will be accompanied by an increase in the average cost. It'll cost them a lot more. And therefore, industries will usually pass on an increase in the cost in the form of a higher price level. And this also helps explain why the short run aggregate supply curve is slanted upward. Okay, so those are some pretty complex things in there, but you got to realize that in every graph that we see, the short run aggregate supply curve is going to be there, and usually that's the reality of where, this is the aggregate demand curve down here, right, two shifts, but usually that's going to be where we're going to see where the economy is actually functioning. And once we get the aggregate long run aggregate supply curve, which in the neoclassical view looks like that, then we're going to be able to see that in the short run, the economy might be operating, say, here, then there, but in the long run, there's a maximum capacity that they have that the economy can accomplish. And in the neoclassical view, it's going to be vertical, right? And that's going to be the long run aggregate supply curve. Okay, so there are some layers for you for the SRAS. So let's give ourselves some more definitions, and maybe you can write this in. And I said much of this, but I'll just go through it again so that you can have it in words on your screen, right? Definition of short run. In our macroeconomic analysis, the short run is defined as the period of time when the prices of the factors of production do not change, right? Most importantly, the price of labor. If a larger level of output is to be produced, firms are likely to face higher average cost production. Makes sense. For example, in order to produce more, firms will have to provide incentives for workers to produce a larger amount. And this is most commonly known as overtime. My dad used to work for Federal Express, and during times of, say, Christmas, they couldn't really find more people to hire, so they just forced him, or asked him, I guess, to pay overtime, or to work overtime. And they were actually able to accomplish more, but at a higher average cost, right? Because they had to pay him more money. So in the short run, then, an increase in output will be accompanied by an increase in the average cost. And industries will pass on the increasing costs in the form of higher price level, which explains why the SRAS is upward sloping. And obviously, in my video here, I got a little ahead of myself. So excuse the last minute or so of being repetitive, but you see why that works. And I hope that that brings a lot of clarity to the short run aggregate supply curve. You got to understand this first. Don't go on to the long run until you understand the short run. All right. I hope you found this video to be helpful, and we'll talk to you in a bit.